Welcome back to The Good, the Bad, and the Uncanny, exploring the Older Testament. We are here today with Reverend Dr. Cleotha Robertson. He is Associate Professor and Director of the Howard Thurman Center at Hartford International University, as well as Senior Pastor for 30 years of Soundview Presbyterian Church in New York. Welcome, Dr. Robertson. We are delighted to have you with us. Thank you for being here today.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here and be here with you.
And we're here today to talk about the prophet Amos. We would love to just hear from you some background about this prophet. Who is he? Who's he talking to, and when? And we'll also want to get into the question why. You know, what is motivating Amos, and what is his message to the people?
Amos is one of the five 8th century prophets that spoke during the time of the resurgence of the Assyrian Empire. It was a time of tremendous wealth and the separation of society, basically from the haves to the have-nots. And so there was a squeezing out of the middle class. The theological ideas in the background is that normally when there's an accumulation of wealth, that means that there is a time of theological orthodoxy. But then when you look at the book of Amos, you see that that's just not the case. It's really oppression of the poor and a misuse of power.
So that's his primary concern seems to be this sort of economic injustice that's happening in the context of a period when this greater accumulation of wealth is leading to sort of a separation of the haves and the have-nots.
Absolutely, absolutely. And interestingly, it's wealth, and then it's also theological orthodoxy and the belief in Yahweh, the belief in Jehovah. And so those two are connected, that the wealth and how well somebody does is connected to following the Lord with a whole heart. And you see that idea obviously, if you look at the wisdom literature in the book of Job, where Job is blessed because Job follows the Lord. And so you see an uncanny collaboration in the book of Amos with wealth, but it's not wealth. It's really oppression of the poor.
Okay. What about Amos himself? What's his kind of social location in all of this?
Interestingly, Amos, by his own account, there when he gets into a confrontation with some of the priests, he was a herdsman, a splitter, as he says, of sycamore trees. He seems to be a middle-class businessman who got an opportunity to travel, and in some sense travel and see the land and the oppression of the poor. He's from Tekoa, which is outside of Bethlehem, about 5-6 miles, and he's called to go to the north. And when he gets challenged on that, he says, "Well, look, I had a job. I was dealing with cattle and sycamore trees, but the Lord called me to be a prophet."
Yeah, that's like one of my favorite parts of the book is when he has that showdown, and because he's literally from a different nation, right? And travels into Israel, and everybody's like, "Hey, why don't you go home and be a prophet there?" You know what I mean? Like, take care of your own mess.
You're right. And he tells them, go eat your bread there.
Yeah. And it kind of like gives him more credibility, doesn't? He's like, "Look, I don't want to be here either, but the Lord called me to do this."
Matt, you're right. Because he's basically telling them, it's not about the money. I got a job. So my motives aren't mixed. And he says, I was after the herd, and the language in the Hebrew is really graphic. He said, and the Lord took me from after the herd.
Yeah.
And so my motives aren't mixed. I'm not doing it for the money. I'm doing it because of the Lord's command.
Yeah. Just kind of feeds that whole theme, right, of prophets being unwelcomed everywhere. And it's like he has a double almost because he's away from home.
Yeah. He's a prophet, and then he's a prophet away from home.
Yeah.
Right. Yep. Doubly outsider there. Yeah.
Basically, you're right. He's an outsider.
Yeah. Yep. Interesting. So what is his relationship with people who are insiders? We've alluded a little bit to this interaction that he has with, is it Amaziah? Am I saying that right? The priest at Bethel, that he gets into a bit of a spat with, the priest who reports him to the king for the work that he's doing there. How is Amos related to, because one of the things we've encountered repeatedly is that when we interact with these prophetic figures, they're not the only ones who are religious leaders. They're in the midst of this other kind of power structure. So how is he interacting with the people, other people who are priests or prophets or kings, or who hold some kind of power?
Well, interestingly, in the Northern Empire, they set up a rival temple there in Samaria that is not Orthodox. And so the prophet Amos is going there and he's challenging them on that, about their orthodoxy, and about in first oracles in chapters 2, you see a collection of 8 oracles. And then chapters 3 through 4, 5, and 6, there are oracles over and over again to the northern kingdom. And it's an abuse of wealth. And then he then comes to, and again, a connection again of theological orthodoxy, and in this case, unorthodoxy, and the accumulation of wealth. And then he challenges them at their seat of power and says, you're wrong. Theologically, you're wrong. Morally, you're wrong. And then Amaziah pushes back. And then Amos pushes back.
Right.
And it's a contest of power. Whose God is the real God? And who's going to win?
Yeah.
So when he's challenging the worship in the North, I mean, those lines, I despise your festivals. I had always read those as a challenge of hypocrisy, right? Challenging people who purport in their worship to be following the Lord, but in their economic and social dealings are oppressing the poor, and so are not. So I'd always read that as a sort of challenging the hypocrisy of people who pay sort of lip service to God, but are not following it up in their living, in their social arrangements, in their economic relationships. But are you also suggesting that he's challenging the very fact of worship in Samaria itself? Is that part of what Amos is critiquing here?
I think yes to you. I think it's both of those.
Okay. Okay.
Clearly, worship has an economic underpinning, that following Yahweh, following the Lord, also has justice built into it. Fairness to the poor, not gleaning to the ends of the field, the sabbatical year at the end of every 7th year, the year of Jubilee, where then land is given back to their ancestral owners, so that every 49th, 50th year, the economy is jump-started. It's almost as if every 50th year, IRS would come in and say, you owe nothing. You owe no money. All of your credit cards are put down to 0.
Nice.
And so that then there's no permanent underclass. And so Amos is addressing 2 things: their theological incorrectness, and then also their oppression of the poor. And it's laden in chapters 3 through 6.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And those things are woven together, right? There's a sense in which, because we've talked a little bit, let me back up a bit. In this series, we've been talking about like what happens when a community doesn't live up to its values that are professed in its religious faith. And it's not, what's at fault there? Is it the values are wrong or the faith is defective? But instead it's this idea that you always need somebody to kind of set you back on track, right? Or to kind of reform the religion, reform the theology. And that's necessarily going to have implications for justice. Is that kind of fair in terms of what's happening in Amos? Does he have, I guess when he has a solution, what is it? Is the solution, first of all, justice, or is the solution, first of all, right religion, or are those so integrated that we can't separate them?
I think for Amos, that worldview is that right religion includes justice.
Okay.
And then when you see economic disparities, then without a sense of sensitivity toward the poor, you can then draw a line to somebody is not following Yahweh correctly. Mm-hmm. And so for Israel and for the larger ancient Near East, there was always a concern for the poor. And Amos over and over again, Micah, all of again, Isaiah, all of these 8th century prophets actually address the idea of the abuse of the poor.
Yeah.
And that fits right into, honestly, in some sense, where we are now with the world economy struggling in some cases, even in our national economies. I'm in New York City, and you just see the struggle. And there's always a debate on raising the minimum wage. I think all my life I've heard that debate. Okay, we're raising it too much, and it must be about $7.50 now. I was just listening just now online to somebody arguing about that.
Yeah.
And what it is how do we make sure the poor are not subjected to a permanent underclass? And in the United States, I think there's always a grapple of how do we ensure freedom and justice for everyone in a system? And so there's individual freedoms, but then there's also larger systems that should be in place that make justice fair for everyone. And Israel has those. And I think maybe we could take a page out of the book again, the sabbatical year, the year of Jubilee. And so it really kind of walks right into our context.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so it seems like this is really a calling back into things that are built into the law, that are built into the system, that are meant to be a part of the life together of ancient Israel, that Amos is calling the people to, or is he? I guess what I'm asking is sort of what's a return to sort of what's already stated as principles and values here, and what's something new that he's introducing?
It's interesting. I think in an interesting way, he introduces for the first time since the time of Moses, the idea of the welfare of the nation collectively and the idea of justice. And I think y'all have already had the Pentateuch in the book of Deuteronomy, chapters 28, 29, 30. There are curses and blessings for obedience to Yahweh. Not only there's curses and blessings, individual blessings, collective blessings, collective curses, individual curses. And Amos is the first person since the 15th, if we're arguing for 15th century date of Moses, and I do, that Amos is the first one that connects that if you don't do right, if you don't do well, the Assyrians are coming. And that's what happens. That's what happens in the 8th century. The Assyrians come and they conquer the northern kingdom.
So go ahead, Margaret.
No, please go ahead, Matt.
So I've got a question about the day of the Lord. I don't think in everything we've done so far in the series, we haven't really hit that language yet. And so that's important, not just for Amos, but for others. And can you help us understand a bit about what the day of the Lord is in the prophet's imagination?
And when Amos is talking about that, the day of the Lord, for him, it's some kind of intervention where God then steps into the life of the nation and does something. And so the language here, the idea there with the wealthy is they think, look how well we're doing. This must mean that Yahweh is going to visit us in a special way. And Amos is saying just the opposite. You're calling for the day of the Lord. But when he comes, it's not going to be what you expect.
Yeah.
You're expecting a check on the status quo, or an attaboy, or attagirl from the Lord. But when you come, no, the Assyrians are coming. Even though quietly, they're not mentioned in the book. They're the major threat that's going to come and displace the nation.
Yeah. So it's that lovely line, right? It's like running away from a lion and running into a bear, right? It's this, but it's not the end of the world. It's not like what Christians would call Judgment Day, but it is this like, right, we want God to intervene and God to act. And that's what, does this mean Amos is talking to people of privilege, or at least the oppressor? He never really offers comfort to the underclass, right? Or to the people who are being left out. Is that fair to say?
there's the idea toward the end that it is going to be fair at the end of the book in chapter 19, that God is going to make it right. But you're right, he is addressing the abusers, and that's the upper class. And you're right, the day of the Lord isn't the Lord is going to come back and time is going to end. That kind of language there is just the idea of some kind of intervention in the time of Amos the prophet, and not some far off theological event that's going to end time as we know it. That's not what he's talking about here. You do have some of that, but that's not here in Amos.
Right. Okay, this is not your end of days, majorly apocalyptic.
End of days, like in Isaiah 24 to 27, or Ezekiel, when you get to that part 40 to 48, that vision of the temple. It's not that.
Yeah. Okay. So what's his view of sort of international relations here? What's happening at the beginning with these sort of oracles against the nations, and how does he understand the relationship of Israel to its neighbors and of God to those neighbors?
Excellent question. You have here 8 or so oracles against the foreign nations, and Yahweh is judging Damascus, Edom, Tyre, Gaza, and then he judges Judah. And then the last oracle in chapter 2 is actually addressed to Israel. First, what is on a macro level, on a large level, what does the oracle say? It says that God is the God of the universe, because he can judge all of these nations, because usually there was the idea that one nation is territorial, it has their own gods, and they do believe in that. But these oracles against all of these nations is a way of saying that the God of Israel is the God of the universe, and he's going to hold all of them to account. And he's calling them account. He's calling them to an account because of egregiances and misuses of power and bloodshed in the context of war. And so when Israel is seeing all of these powers get vanquished by the Lord, it's like, that's right, Lord, get them, sick them, sick them, sick them. But then the Lord then calls Judah to account. And then the longest oracle of all of these is the oracle against Israel. And so the idea is that if God holds the foreign nations to account, and you look at the oracles, they're like 2 and 3 abuses. Then you look at Israel, it's about 8 or 9 different ones. So it's arguing from, in some sense, the lesser to the greater. You know better, but you've oppressed the poor. I've revealed myself to you. You know better. I've called you out of Egypt. You know better. And if I held them to an account, how much more so I'm going to hold you to an account. Mm-hmm. So the oracles in a fascinating way just make Israel look that much worse. Mm-hmm. Because they've done as much and more than the other foreign nations have done.
Yeah. And yet they had the advantages, so to speak, right?
Yes.
They had the knowledge. Yeah.
Yes. And he reminds them that over and over again. He goes back to the Exodus. I took you out of Egypt. I walked you through the wilderness. And the idea again is that you know better, but you didn't do better.
I really appreciated in the comment that you just made about the beginnings of those oracles, your attention to the sort of rhetorical effect of piling them on, starting small to ones we can all agree with, and then being like, he's talking about us now. I hear a little bit of sort of reading this as a preacher and a scholar at the same time, attending to the sort of effect of those words. I really appreciate that. What can you tell us kind of about the afterlife of Amos, or the reception history, or how communities have heard and understood Amos, not just as a prophet of the past, but a prophet of the present?
Good point. I think the afterlife of it is that the idea of social justice is something that resonated with the civil rights movement. and you see different civil rights leaders reaching back and connecting the idea of justice and fairness to orthodoxy. Martin Luther King looked at the Constitution and some of the civil rights leaders and said, on paper, this is what's said, but in actuality, this is what's done. And there's a disconnect between the two. And then African scholars looking at the same text raised questions about colonial and European powers, where you're carrying the Bible, but also you're disenfranchising us. And there's a disconnect between the two. So that for communities of color, both national and international, the book of Amos is one that shows that the gospel has to be holistic, that it has to deal with how we live our lives individually and collectively, but also how we follow the Lord.
How does so how, if people know anything about Amos, they probably are familiar with the language in Amos 5, right? About let justice roll down and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream, which is beautiful. How would you also help us set that in context with the whole of the book? You know what I mean? So we don't just think that that's read one verse and you know the whole book of Amos, right? But how does it, and obviously you can't beat the imagery there. I mean, it's a beautiful line and maybe in any language, but yeah, what advice would you give on learning to set that in the bigger context of like Amos's project? Does that make sense? Especially around the issue of how the book still speaks, especially around the issue of how orthodoxy should be committed to justice, actively committed to justice.
A lot of times in theological circles, what we do is we have our individual faith and our relationship to God. And that's how we define it. I'm basically evangelical. I don't like the term so much in these contexts as a person of color, but the idea of orthodoxy, I check those boxes. But then I think if we're taking orthodoxy seriously, then we have to read the Bible not only individually, but the Bible talks about groups and how groups are impacted by worship. And in the Old Testament and in the New Testament, there's a concern about the least, the left out, the lost. And when God calls Israel, they're a ruddy, small band, and God blesses them. And then out of that experience, they're called to have a sensitivity to the poor and the oppressed, because the God of the Bible deals with the poor and oppressed. You see the same thing with that I think in the New Testament as well. So that the idea of justice is not something outside of the gospel. It's a part of the gospel because it involves how we treat one another, how we live next to one another, how we employ one another, how we don't employ one another, are issues of theological orthodoxy and faith. And that faith involves justice. Justice is not outside of that. It's a part of that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We've split that somehow.
Yes.
I know, it's true.
Yes.
We've let those.
Haven't we? People are like, some churches are social justice churches and some churches are actually personal faith churches, as if those are, yeah.
It's, you know what's interesting? In Martin Luther King's letter to a Birmingham jail, he's behind the bars.
Yeah.
And he's talking to the soldiers and the prisoners on the other side of the bars. And he's telling them, you and I are dealing with the same thing. We want good schools for our kids. We want good wages, to livelihood for our families. I'm fighting for the same thing that you want for your family. And so the color part and how we value it in the United States has got in the way, but we check boxes on the same kind of things.
Yeah.
So that we should be on the same team with that, especially when it comes to issues of faith.
I really appreciate the sort of insight, not just about the relationship between the worship and justice, or between faith and right action, but also this sense of this sort of God dealing with groups, and with how are you doing as a collective in living together into the ideals and the values that are contained in the Torah, that are essential to the covenant between God and God's people. And I do think sometimes the judgment language of the Older Testament, one of the things that people can do when they make that quick and easy, Old Testament is judgment, New Testament is grace. That's one of those things that Matt and I have been sort of pushing against this entire time, is that easy bifurcation. But that judgment language is often delivered to groups, not just to individual people. It's not about one person believing the wrong thing and they go to hell. It's about God being really upset with the injustices that are prevalent in society as a whole.
Absolutely.
Did you see that sort of as a part of the trend in Amos here too, of that sort of collective?
I think he's calling to account. You're right. Sorry, go ahead.
No, please go ahead.
I think you're right. He's calling individuals account, but he's calling to account systems that oppress the poor. And it's both of those. Some of the individuals might set the atmosphere for the systems. And so it's individuals, but clearly as well, he's addressing some of the systems that involve that oppress the poor as a group. And then how do you challenge those systems? You challenge those who are in power, who can address those systems, like the prophet Amaziah, who has access to the king. The king, and one of the king's major roles in the larger society, it's one person, major role was that of securing justice and fairness. And you see that in the Old Testament, you see that in Deuteronomy, that you'll look at 17 and 18, that the king's role was to make sure that justice was secure.
Absolutely. Well, Dr. Robertson, thank you so much for your time with us. We really appreciate this this deep dive into Amos, and also looking at and understanding what Amos's legacy has been and continues to be. We're so grateful that you took this time with us. Thank you.
I'm honored to be with you, and I appreciate you reaching out to me.
Yeah, thank you.